glory to Ukraine and death to the enemies. My name is Fakhruddin Sharafmal, and I'm speaking with Andriy Vijerinsky to discuss key topics. Andriy, good to see you. Good morning, Fareed. We wish you all a good week, and even better news, as this week is really important in terms of global politics and the U.S. elections. However, these issues are epochal and new age, but we will have days of the week when we can discuss the American election in general. Today, we'll discuss international press coverage, starting with The Washington Post, which reports that U.S. allies in Europe are preparing for a potential breakdown in transatlantic relations if Donald Trump wins the election. We are talking about certain mishaps that may arise in the event of his presidency in matters of defense, trade, partnerships in different regions, and so on. Are they really so afraid of Trump that these issues really need to be reconsidered? Besides, since this has happened, defense is their problem, not the problem of the Americans, as Donald Trump has repeatedly said during his previous presidency. You know, there is a way to exaggerate the importance of a personality in history. And now, in relation to Donald Trump, similar theses are being used as an element of horror stories, which are probably aimed primarily at the American audience, because the American publication is demonstrating that Donald Trump's policies may have a negative impact on relations with allies. And relations with allies are, for example, a guarantee of the security of the United States. The Bipartisan Congressional Commission on National Security stated in its report that the U.S. national security policy relies not only on its own capabilities, but also on alliances, which is public information. Alliances and unions play two key roles. The U.S. faces a unique risk due to its geographical location, as it would be the first to take a hit in the event of a military threat. Discussions often revolve around threats to the interests of its land and naval forces, particularly concerning allies like Japan, South Korea, and Europe, where the U.S. has no presence beyond military bases. Military bases differ from consulates and embassies. In the event of military expansion, the first victims are partners and allies on the front lines who bear the risks of hostilities. This situation allows the U.S. to gain an advantage by providing time to regroup, plan, and organize logistics during conflicts. Що дає можливість в випадку бойових дій Сполученим Штатам перевагу отримати, яка називається час. Час достатній для того, щоб згрупуватись, спланувати, організувати логістику. And the second component of allies is money, because allies are not only about, say, military cooperation, but also about certain cooperation, both in the military-industrial complex and in the economy. About 2 years ago, Jacob Sullivan gave a lecture in Boston discussing changes in U.S. policy regarding globalism and relationships with technological and economic allies. And in this case, the United States is moving away from the concept of free movement of goods, works, and services, which is the three pillars of any liberal democratic agenda or free market economy. It is moving away from a concept called technological advantage, as well as the benefits of reciprocal economic relations. Those partners who share our values with us get these benefits. And what are our values? Our values are, in addition to liberalism, democracy, and so on, a view of the world, a view of right and wrong, a view of, say, if we are talking about a central structure, a joint vote in the General Assembly or the UN Security Council. What are these advantages? These advantages include unrestricted imports and exports, access to markets, and advanced technologies, positively impacting both their economy and that of the United States. If a country fails to meet these criteria, it loses benefits and turns to alternative markets, indicating a shift away from globalization. It's not in relation to Donald Trump, but in general within the framework of, there's a word for this, continuity. Well, the continuity of both politics and the continuity of a position in general, which in general takes place between, well, different ones over a long period of time and persists despite the change of political elites. We have forgotten about these words, or rather, in the Ukrainian reality, we have never remembered them. Our impulse often seeks decisive changes that overturn previous political norms. However, in the U.S., continuity persists regardless of whether Democrats or Republicans are in power. A leader like Donald Trump can provide additional momentum to this continuity.
Республіканці змінюють демократію, вона зберігається. І Дональд Трамп, чи будь-який інший лідер, який обирається, він може надати додатково...
Which has already been voiced as it follows, for example by Mr. Biden himself. How can he do this?
Скажімо, самим паном Байденом. Як він може це зробити?
He can continue the same policy that is now being presented at the summit in Washington, D.C. as a positive trend in the North Atlantic Alliance's relations, as emphasized by representatives of the Joseph Biden administration. What are we talking about? The point is that out of 32 members, 28 NATO members have already reached the level of 2% of GDP defense spending. This is not enough, and the European Union is well aware of this because Mr. Draghi's report, which was prepared for the European Commission and handed over to Ursula von der Leyen a few months ago, states that for Europe to ensure its security, defense spending, because it has been sinking, is essential. Since 1991, when the geopolitical enemy Europe and the North Atlantic Alliance prepared to face disappeared, defense expenditures were reduced. To address the resulting gap, countries now need to increase their spending to at least 3 to 4% of GDP to strengthen their defense capabilities.
Іноді 4% ВВП кожної країни на посилення власної обороноздатності.
In the United States, there is also a question related to defense spending, despite the fact that they have adopted a position and trend of withdrawal, or a slight reduction of their presence in the European Union.
Воно теж знаходиться в площині необхідності зростання видатків до рівня інфляція плюс 2%.
Are also in line with the need to increase spending to the level of inflation plus 2%. Given that inflation there is currently within 3%, defense spending should be within 5%. But what kind of war are they preparing for? They are preparing for the possibility of defending their territory from the threats of China's and Russia's air and space forces, for the rearmament of the nuclear triad, for the renewal and increase of production capacities, and for a conflict in the Asia-Pacific region.
Бо в ньому Сполучені Штати без євразійського партнерства, євроатлантичного партнерства, да?
The U.S. cannot withdraw from the Eurasian partnership without weakening both itself and its European allies, making them vulnerable to rising powers. This unity will evolve, and Europe must invest more in its own defense, a reality recognized by European leaders. Recently, Mr. Draghi and Mr. Tusk discussed geopolitical outsourcing and the security dependence of EU countries on the U.S. umbrella, highlighting this shared concern.
Пан Драгі і пан Туск, зокрема, по-моєму, чи на вихідних, чи в п'ятницю написав там допис про, скажімо, геополітичний аутсорс, а пан Драгі у звіті писав про безпекову ренту, яку споживали країни Європейського Союзу від безпеки там, чи можливості бути накритими парасолькою безпеки Сполучених Штатів. Вони ж пишуть про одне і те ж саме. Вони всі
Everybody, at the level of the top leaders of the European Union, is aware that the degree of the United States' presence in Europe will be reduced. And this is something that Mr. Trump talked about when he was President of the United States, the 45th President. He said that Europe should spend more. Now that Europe is spending more, people are saying, my God, what a success. It turns out Mr. Trump was right. So why do we assume that this trend, which is a common thread among Democrats and Republicans, should or can change? There are no prerequisites for this, and thus no real facts in the American publications, which rely on exaggerations or horror stories for the election campaign. They can claim, for example, that Trump will harm economic relations with European partners by imposing 100% or 200% import duties. Will our partners leave or get offended and turn to China? They will not turn to China because their energy dependence on the United States is enormous. In particular, in terms of natural gas. The security component does not allow us to do this now, so they will be patient. They will endure and obey the rules that have already been set, because the Anti-Inflationary Act introduced by Joseph Biden and his administration provides for a whole set of restrictions for European producers that appear when they relocate to the U.S. market. This is causing part of the industrial base to shift from Europe, much to the discontent of Europeans. The conflicts between the European Commission and the U.S. have been discussed in analytical publications for at least 2 years since the Anti-Inflationary Act was introduced. However, there is little coverage of Biden harming relations with European partners. Why is that? Because it's not Biden who is running for election now, but his Anti-Inflationary Act is the reindustrialization of America, which is for the benefit of Americans. Therefore, the bias of the American press, especially given the propaganda nature of their materials, also largely distorts the reality in which we live. But the bottom line is that it is impossible to abandon the partner that the United States is for Europe today. Europe cannot, because it does not have enough subjectivity, enough economic and military capacity to turn around and say, no, we will be an independent geopolitical center. They need decades to do this, and these decades should be accompanied by a reduction in the number of problems, a reduction in the number or volume of expenditures they incur on social needs. They are aware of this, but can't act quickly due to European bureaucracy and the globalist elite's influence following the European Parliament elections. This elite believes in maintaining equality through high social spending, which complicates their ability to change their approach to voters. These processes are complex and take years to unfold.
Перед своїми виборцями. Це складні процеси, вони розтягуються в цілому на роки. В цілому вони розтягуються на роки.
At first glance, they are invisible, but they are discussed in the Washington Post or Wall Street Journal. Ideally, there should be no war on the continent to allow time for these changes, as war significantly drains resources and hinders reorganization. While it may push some initiatives forward, the redistribution of expenditures due to war complicates the situation. And it would seem that this is exactly what you can go to your citizens with and say, look, we are squeezing a little bit here. We are lowering social standards here. We are cutting spending here. Why? Because there is a war. We need to strengthen our defense capabilities, build factories, produce tanks. As a result, the focus of public spending is shifting from social welfare to militarization. If you want to extend this process over 5 to 10 years, the war factor loses its effectiveness as an argument. Gradually reducing spending while claiming to stretch the program means facing issues like building new plants and employee shortages, all while organizing a green transition that incurs additional costs. In terms of European policy, they are not using the ongoing war in Ukraine as a reason to change their approach in 2022. I mean, that's why I say that globalists remain the dominant, in fact, the elite in the European Union, who believe that in general, it may be possible to get through this stage without a radical change in policy. But well, as an example, the United States, starting or participating in the war on the Korean Peninsula in the 1950s, had defense spending, let's say, before the start of a full-scale military campaign, in the range of $15 billion. And at the time of the start of hostilities, the amount of defense spending increased to 70. This is a multiple that is, let's say, tangible, not a fraction of a percent of GDP, not 0.25%. GDP plus 100 million, multiplied by 4, and used by everyone except the United States, where they loaded production, but also in occupied Germany, with a center, though not in Berlin, but in Bonn, yes, and also allowed the German industry to recover after World War II. But this is the moment when there is a reason, there is an understanding of the confrontation, there is involvement, and there is a redistribution of expenditures, and then the tax burden changes to cover these redistributed expenditures, and the income tax, the share of corporate tax, and so on, grows.
Але це є момент, коли є привід, є розуміння протистояння, є залученість і є перерозподіл видатків.
Europe lacks the necessary resources, so while the war slows development, it could also prompt changes in domestic policy to accelerate its resolution. However, Europe has not taken this opportunity. Let's hope they can still use this chance, as there is still time while the war continues.
Але фактор війни одночасно може бути і тим, що змушує змінити внутрішню політику, змінити цю внутрішню політику таким чином, щоб ти стимулював чи прискорив завершення війни.
That is, they still have opportunities to get in this last train. But by the way, CNN wrote that Putin is unlikely to sit down at the negotiating table to end the war against Ukraine, regardless of who wins in the United States. Can't the Trump-Vance plan work? What an unfortunate surprise. Yes, a surprise. But why is it unfortunate?
Все ж таки встигнути в цей останній вагон. Але, до речі, CNN написали про те, що Путін навряд чи сяде за стіл переговорів, які стосуватимуться в
For Ukrainians, I think it's the top one. And it's all within the framework of the President's office's thesis that we have excellent relations with the Republicans, and they will accept the position that is ours. Our position was voiced by Andrei Borisovich. Andrei Borisovich said that the withdrawal of troops to the borders of 91 is an unconditional requirement of our peace plan, and Russia will end the war in this way. CNN argues that the visionaries in Ukraine were correct in asserting that Trump's plan, influenced by Vance's vision, would not work. While Trump's plan may differ in implementation, the broader issue is the difficulty of discussing plans and initiatives, which cannot be resolved by debates about their effectiveness or popularity.
Це не стільки план Трампа, скільки бачення Венса. Бо план Трампа може відрізнятися від бачення Венса з огляду на те, що...
We evaluate all plans from the point of view of whether they are suitable for us, and there is not a single plan that suits us yet, except for the one that is, of course, ours.
Яка є, скажімо, такою, яку не можна подолати аргументами про те, дієвий план чи недієвий. Правильний чи неправильний, подобається чи не подобається. Ми всі плани оцінюємо з точки зору того, чи вони підходять нам. І ще немає ні одного плану, який нам би підходив.
If we consider the question of negotiations, not as a question of an ultimatum or capitulation of the Russian Federation. Well, from this point, we are extremely far away on the battlefield, extremely far away on the diplomatic field of clashes, and on the economic field of the party's capabilities. Yes. Then when we talk about a plan that includes a clause, diplomacy, we should speak from the position that diplomacy involves two parties to the conflict. And it is important to evaluate the plan, in addition to whether it suits us, whether it suits the country that is the aggressor, and which, as of today, is taking an offensive position on the battlefield. We are not considering whether this plan is acceptable or whether it allows for certain concessions. When we analyze Vance's plan, or Trump's plan, which is voiced by candidates or members of his staff, we are outraged or perceive it as negative from the point of view that it does not suit us, because our plan is absolute. It is a plan of surrender to Russia. Again, it exists, and it's great to the extent that it is, let's say, supported by the circumstances of reality. This issue exceeds our analysis scope, so we've established specific research conditions. Excluding battlefield circumstances, the positions of other countries, and support levels. We focused on a theoretical model, setting aside research factors, time, battlefield results, and resource exhaustion. Although this model suits our beliefs, theoretical research is still not being conducted.
Навіть теоретичні дослідження не проводяться. Це якась така містифікація, яку ми собі вигадали в голові. Ну і поки що нею рухаємося, тому що іншої немає. Або всі інші.
This is a hoax we've created that we cling to due to a lack of alternatives. And any manifestations will be interpreted through the established criminal code, which the Ukrainian community cannot accept. The Americans are not limited by our criminal code. They offer a different approach that they think can achieve some success, more than, say, our plan.
Певного успіху, більшого, ніж, допустимо, наш план. Американці мають на увазі там адміністрація потенційна чи офіс.
The potential Trump administration has not clarified whether there were consultations with Russia or if Russia was informed about their plans. Official Kremlin statements exist, and one does not need to be CNN or the BBC to compare the proposal to freeze the war along the contact line.
Офіційні заяви Кремля, вони вже пролунали, і не треба бути ні CNN, ні BBC для того, щоб співставити план, який стосується замороження війни там по лінії зіткнення, да?
With the Kremlin's thesis, which was voiced by Putin in July at a meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, that the withdrawal of troops should take place from the Ukrainian side to the geographical or administrative borders of the regions that the Russian Federation considers to be annexed to its territory by virtue of illegal referendums. This reflects a disagreement over the stopping point and the Russian precondition of withdrawing Ukrainian troops. Russia's stance contradicts the Friends for Peace initiative, supported by 11 countries through the UN, which emphasizes communication before ceasing hostilities. While Russia views its position as constructive for negotiations, no similar stance has been expressed regarding the Vance or Trump plans.
З огляду на те, хто її ініціював, називає конструктивною чи такою, від якої можна відштовхнутися для переговорів. Таких позицій по відношенню до плану Венса чи плану Трампа не озвучувалось.
Why were they not voiced? Because the initiative proposed on the basis of the UN is broader. It contains a provision called the resolution of any conflict, and it is in the plane of realizing the causes that led to this war. And taking into account the interests of all parties. Vance does not voice this position. This wording points to the events leading up to the war, which were primarily shaped by Russia's communications with the United States regarding strategic security and NATO weapons, rather than direct communications with Ukraine, despite the Normandy format's involvement.
Стратегічної безпеки і певних озброєнь Північно-Атлантичного альянсу, які знаходяться в зоні, яку Росія вважає небезпечною для своєї національної безпеки.
Accordingly, the question of ending the war or Trump's initiatives, Vance's initiatives, and others will compel Putin to link the end of the war to the U.S. position in Eastern Europe. War is an organized form of violence that addresses political contradictions unresolved by diplomacy.
В Східній Європі. Тобто ми повернемося, ми все рівно зробимо круг, коло, да? Є ж. Війна, знаєш, це організована форма насильства, яка допомагає вирішити
Attempts at diplomacy in the 21st century, such as Lavrov meeting Blinken, have yielded no results.
У 21-му році Лавров напроти Блінкена сидів, Блінкен напроти Лаврова, і вони ні до чого не прийшли.
In matters relating to the security policy on the Eurasian continent in general.
Ну, бо саме це вони обговорювали.
Then we went in and are in a state of active hostilities on the territory of Ukraine, where the Russian side is. In addition to his comments on hostilities in Ukraine, he also addresses the United States and NATO countries. Exit from the active phase of the war, which decides whether to force the enemy to submit to the political will of another enemy. It is possible through diplomacy, but it will return to the original position, which was communicated before the battle. We don't know Trump's position, Vance's position, or Kamala Harris's position at all, and they are ready to change their position on European security. Therefore, if the aggressor side says that the outcome of the war, in addition to the history that relates directly to Ukraine, is the establishment of a fairer security system on the Eurasian continent, then the issue of ending hostilities, the issue of settling the war, is not only the sole will of Ukraine and Russia, but also the will of the United States to change its own policy on the Eurasian security map. What we have just tried to talk about is so inaccessible in terms of perception, neither by Ukrainians in general, nor by Ukrainian politicians, nor by official rhetoric, nor by the information media, that it seems to be basically impossible in terms of what has been learned, by the way, and not only by us, I think, on our part.
Що виглядає, в принципі, неможливим з точки зору засвоєння.
The Washington Post noted that Russia, though not publicly, supports Donald Trump's presidency. However, the discussed victory plans and conditions are unfavorable for Russia. Interestingly, no one has definitively stated that any outcome will be beneficial for any party. So, isn't it premature to conclude what will or won't be advantageous?
Конкретно. 1, 2, 3. Є певні припущення, тому чи не здається, що зарано стверджувати, що щось може бути...
For example, the Russian Federation will like this point, and Ukraine will like this point, because none of these points have been discussed publicly. No one has discussed them, except for Vance. But as you said, what Vance thinks and what Vance writes doesn't mean that Donald Trump agrees with him and has the same opinion. I don't believe countries root for a candidate. It's more wishful thinking than reality. I mean, how can you be a fan? Putting up posters, sitting at a table and looking at a MAGA cap. How can you be a fan? This is another tactic to discredit opponents during elections. We see numerous publications claiming Chinese cyber troops are supporting Kamala, while Iranian cyber troops are backing others. Chinese and Russian cyber forces are battling, indicating some influence. Candidates are labeled as pro-Russian in various elections across Europe, Moldova, and Georgia. We live in a world where Russia is viewed as a universal evil, permeating nearly the entire planet.
проросійські кандидати, в Молдові проросійські кандидати, в Грузії проросійські кандидати. Ми живемо таке враження, що в світі, в якому існує Росія, яка, безперечно, є вселенським злом.
You see, this is how capable a huge gas station country is, which basically rules the planet through its pro-Russian politicians in Europe, South America, and North America. Everywhere it has integrated men and women who are 60, 70 years old, millionaires, billionaires. They rule the planet.
Мужиків, дядьків, жінок, яким по 60, по 70 років, які мільйонери, мільярдери. І вони управляють планетою. Це перебільшення.
This is an artistic exaggeration of the significance of certain elements in international politics, often through a politician's connection with an aggressor country. To stigmatize someone, it's enough to label them as an agent of the Kremlin. But why is that inherently bad?
З боку певного політика в певній країні через призму його зв'язку з країною-агресором. Тобто для того, щоб тебе заклеймувати, достатньо сказати, ти агент Кремля. Чого? А чого це погано?
Since the Kremlin started the war in Ukraine, being labeled a Kremlin agent is negative. However, such statements serve no real purpose. They merely create the image that you can gain power and that millions of Americans, supposedly Kremlin agents, support you.
І в цілому за тебе готові проголосувати із 300 мільйонів американців, яких виборців, умовно 150-160, за тебе готові проголосувати 80 мільйонів американців.
Russia has managed to multiply so much that it has produced these Kremlin agents in various states, from the north to the south of the United States, or from the east to the west coast. It seems to me that this is ridiculous. When we talk about cheering, not cheering, we are talking about the willingness to reach agreements, the willingness to sit down at the negotiating table, the willingness to set conditions, in which the degree of existence and the degree of, say, security for countries for a certain period of time will be ensured by those political elites who will take on the responsibility. Is Biden's campaign ready to take on Obama's responsibilities? No, I don't see it. It's easier for them from the point of view of domestic American politics to allocate aid packages of $10 billion or $12 billion a year and continue the rhetoric that democracy must win, evil will be punished, and Ukraine is standing and we will not sit down at the negotiating table. Because all decisions are up to Ukraine. Can we sit down at the negotiating table with the Russians? No. Why? Because there is no way without Ukraine. Ukraine is asking you to increase the aid many times over so that we can achieve results on the battlefield, not by occupying or being occupied, but by deoccupying or building a strong position. You might say, we don't have many supporters, but that won't stop us from avoiding negotiations. Russia's claims don't concern us, since we're on the other side of the world. This position can be effectively integrated into public discourse through the media. In contrast, another candidate might argue that the situation needs to end, as it harms business and the economy, emphasizing other priorities. And we, as a country that has to regain its greatness, and this greatness can only be regained in matters related to strength, we must close this issue as soon as possible, allow our partners to develop, allow us to develop, and in general, from the point of view of humanity, which is a priority, stop killing people. Because the trend on the battlefield, although the Democrats do not admit it, does not look like Ukraine will win somewhere in the foreseeable future. If there is no victory in sight, why continue to destroy the country? This logic has the right to live. It is not defective in terms of not reflecting the factor of reality. In this vein, in terms of the ability to engage in dialogue, well, not even dialogue, but before diplomatic mechanisms are engaged, the Democrats do not demonstrate this ability or intention to do so. Trump's position emphasizes dialogue, making claims that Russians support him misleading. Analyzing candidates reveals a clear divide. One side rejects dialogue, while the other advocates for diplomacy from a position of strength to minimize bloodshed. From this perspective, one could suggest
і причому включати її там з позиції сили і завершувати це безперервне, беззмістовне і безцільне кровопролиття. Тому, якщо в такому ракурсі дивитися, то
that Russia might favor Trump.
Росія вболіває за Трампа.
The question is, will dialogue and diplomacy lead to its success?
Приведе до її успіху.
No, I'm not sure. Then, what is the risk of diplomacy from the point of view of the Democrats? These cliched publications about who supports whom have oversimplified thinking in Ukraine, attempting to reduce complex world politics to primitive narratives. And I'm sorry that, let's say, the complexity of understanding the situation, despite the fact that the war is even taking place on the territory of Ukraine, is extremely low among Ukrainian citizens. This is a philosophical conclusion, based on what is happening in the United States, on how their election process is going, and how it is being covered in the States.
По тому, що відбувається в Сполучених Штатах, по тому, як триває оцей їхній виборчий процес, і по тому, як його висвітлюють в Штатах,
in our country, when it comes to comparing the electoral processes and the theses that are heard there, I don't have the strength, in fact, and I'll be honest, to try to convince, to analyze all this information. Because in terms of elections, in terms of the theses that are heard, it is a very thankless task. But who better than us to know this? We know that we are systematically engaged in a thankless task, because we are resilient. Because we are resilient. Andriy, thank you for the conversation. Thank you for watching this far, and we hope to stay with you for a long time. By the way, if you are out there, please write to us and let us know. You can leave a comment and like this video, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. So we're not saying goodbye for a long time, but we'll see you soon.